the Eagles are the better team, and the Eagles are going to win the Super Bowl. Welcome back to another episode of The Edge. I'm Eagles Eric, and today I'm joined with an esteemed guest, Amrit Vignesh. It is episode 8. If you watched last episode, it also said it was episode 8, but that was erroneous. It was actually episode 7. So I just wanted to give you some context there. But Amrit is a analytics guru, and he actually is well versed in a variety of sports. And so I brought him on today to kind of ask him about the sports analytics world. He has an internship with the Pittsburgh Penguins, but also forays into a bunch of different sports. So how you doing?
Doing great, Eric. Yeah, I mean, really enjoying the summer with the Penguins. I think it's great to see sports analytics being involved in so many different sports in general. Obviously, there are sports which we'll get into, but there are obviously sports where, there may be a higher level of analytics, but I think a lot of, teams and leagues are adopting it, and I think it's great. Yeah, it's been amazing so far.
Yeah. I'm kind of someone who just jumps straight in to the hard-hitting questions. So my first question is, baseball had its Moneyball revolution 2 decades ago. And by all accounts, football, which is kind of the sport I specialize in, it's still catching up. So you kind of having an idea of the sports analytics landscape, where would you place the NFL on that adoption timeline? And what barriers do you see that are still in the way to kind of reach where we are in baseball, whether it's the culture that exists within football coaching staffs, access to data, technology, etc.?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting question. Obviously, I think a lot of people, when they think of analytics, they think of Moneyball, they think of baseball, and it's been seen like, baseball is where most of the jobs in analytics are, and, you see data, through broadcasts and everything. Almost, it seems like everything in baseball is almost run on data, maybe a little bit exaggerated, but, there's a lot of aspects of math in baseball. Now, football, I think it's really interesting. I think things like the public sphere of football has actually, been really well recently. I think the NFL is not necessarily by directly, how willing people are adopting it. It's also the design of the sport itself. I think things like baseball, because it's full of discrete events, which are, mostly defined by individual matchups, mostly looking at pitcher versus hitter, those are much more easier to find, and you can, attribute numbers to these players on the field and general team qualities. I think much easier than a sport like football where there's so many interactions on the field. 22 people on the field. I think it makes it difficult to sometimes split credit in a way. Now, I do think that football is still ahead of some other sports because it is still full of like discrete events, play by play. So I would put it over basketball and hockey in terms of like how analytically driven it is. Now, it always just depends, I guess if you're asking the question how analytically driven it is, that is also dependent on how much teams want to invest in it. So I know there are teams that probably don't really invest into analytics at all, may have like one or two staffers max, and there may be hockey or basketball teams that have more. But I still think in general, I think in terms of the future and how the sport is designed, I think, it definitely has a lot of potential. I don't think it will be at the level of baseball anytime soon, but I think as you're seeing more data coming in to teams and also in the public sphere, I think it's going to increase pretty rapidly.
Yeah, and for those people who are not familiar, there's a site called Baseball Savant, and I'm just a recreational fan of baseball, but I find myself pouring through all the amazing stats on there. I would just love to have an NFL version of that. Do you think that's something that could happen in the next couple of years?
Yeah, I think definitely, obviously there are websites that are giving your base statistics. Obviously I think a lot of people, when they grow up looking at stats, they look at things like ESPN. There's also Pro Football Reference, which is pretty decent. Like, you're getting decent data there. Nothing too on the complex level. Like Baseball Savant is very granular, and I think, it is really just a question. Obviously analytics is used in more of a competitive way now. Teams want to gain that advantage. So Baseball Savant is great for providing that public data. But in football, having that public data may not even be like, there are teams that may want to buy those types of websites. Like I know in hockey, more on the cap side, but there used to be Cap Friendly, which was a website, which had a lot of salary cap data, and it turned out to be bought by the Washington Capitals. So, it's all about that competitive advantage these days. So, it would be interesting to see a website like that. I think there are being a lot of efforts made, and I think there's one that, is made by some people similar to like, I think some people who are associated with that like NFL verse package, or it's called Game on Paper. I think they do a lot of NFL and college football like scores with a lot of the more granular statistics. Obviously, it's not like, you're not getting like perfect, like I don't think it's at the level of what Baseball Savant has, but I think, definitely one day hopefully it's there publicly, and hopefully analytics is accessible to all, but we also have to understand that teams are trying to gain a competitive advantage. Some of the data we may have now may increase in value, some may just totally diminish and get bought by a team eventually.
Yeah, one of the things you mentioned was you thought football maybe was still ahead of basketball and hockey because those are just constantly flowing. There's not those discrete plays. But I do want to challenge you on that because I think about an NFL season, just 16 games, maybe 150 plays in a game. And if you look at it like on the event scale, I feel like it doesn't have nearly as much as something like basketball. So I do think sample size is a problem in football. So my question is, how does this limited play volume over the course of the season affect if you're trying to model interactions within the game, the error bars if you're trying to look at a team's tendencies, and basically ultimately like teams when they go to act on these analytics outputs, can they be confident in them?
Yeah, I mean, I do think, football analytics, obviously, the individuals who are working there are pretty smart to kind of, notice that, their sports may not have as much data, on a season level compared to some of these other sports. So, they've probably adapted their models to kind of, do that. And, they may be trained on a larger set of seasons rather than what you may see in some other sports. Obviously, yeah, I think sample size is a huge issue. You could see like, the stability of models and the results you get could be, highly affected by sample size, especially things like if you're looking at year to year correlation. If you want to look, how well a certain quarterback is progressing from year to year, you might see much more variation. And that may not even be an issue with, obviously it could be an issue just a quarterback changing style, and maybe there were some challenges they faced in a certain season which may have affected those correlations. But it could be the issue of sample size, and things like injuries. Once you have an injury, those could remove a lot of data for certain players. You could only be playing maybe half the season, which obviously isn't enough to even like make a lot of really nice conclusions. So yeah, I think there is definitely the issue with sample size, but I think that you know, I think a lot of data scientists within the industries have kind of realized how to deal with that. And, I think there are ways to, kind of counteract, that issue. And I think, obviously, 16 games, definitely not a lot compared to other sports, but I still think it is a decent amount of data to kind of describe a player. And I'm sure that, there are data scientists out there who have taken certain steps they need to kind of, create more, I guess, accurate conclusions, which are probably more stable over time.
One thing I've been, a big, I guess, fan of is the one stop metrics for players. And you have ones in baseball like WOBA, Corsi in hockey, Darko in basketball. There's a million of these acronyms. But when it comes to the players, football still lacks a universally accepted one stop metric. Pretty much the extent of what we have is like PFF grade, which people don't like. So my question is, what metric or framework could become football's version of WOBA, one numbered teams and media rally around in the next few years?
Yeah, that's an
Yeah, and
interesting question.
basically, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. But yeah, that's an interesting question. I would say obviously one star metrics, yes, they are free, obviously they try to describe entire performance, across the player, in all different aspects of the game. But obviously, why if these were very accurate, then you wouldn't see the need for analytics in a lot of these organizations. But obviously they're not. So, these one stop metrics obviously, don't tell a lot. Like, yes, on a simple level, they could give you like, for example, if you see Darko, there is a little bit of variation with pitcher versus hitter, but for the most part, and even on the fielding side, for the most part, a lot of these players have the same statistics, even if they're, it doesn't really matter if they're like a second baseman versus a third baseman on the field, a lot of these even defensive metrics, like outs above average and all of those could apply in all cases. In hockey, obviously forwards and defensemen are technically two different roles, and goalie would have separate statistics, but like forwards and defensemen both play for the same thing. They try to score goals, they try to get chances. Now, the issue with NFL is, I think, basically, depending on what position you are, you're only going to accumulate a certain set of statistics. Quarterbacks, obviously, they have the ability to rush and all of that, so they can gain rushing, statistics in addition to the passing stats that they normally would get, but they're not going to have receiving stats. Same goes with the receiver. I mean, obviously, there could be trick plays, but they're not going to accumulate enough passing statistics, depending on the type of player they are. So the issue, I think, with the all-in-one aspect is just there's so many different aspects to the game. Now, even if you think of it on an individual level, like, is there a quarterback all-in-one metric? I wouldn't say not really. I do think there are metrics that are pretty decent out there. I think EPA isn't a bad metric, like expected points added. So that's a decent metric that I think has been popularized within the football analytics industry and has been used a lot in public work. When you see like leaderboards and stuff, especially when they're adjusted for things like strength or schedule, it's a very it's a pretty decent statistic. But at the same time, EPA is a team statistic. It basically defines how much a team is adding to maybe the expected points or the amount, like the amount of points they're actually going to score in that drive. Essentially, it kind of takes each individual play, assigns an expected points of it, based on how much they can progress the field, maybe how much time they have, the down they're on, and tries to attribute that individually. So, obviously the quarterback has been kind of defined to be the leader of the team of some sorts. They're the ones, basically, they're the ones receiving the ball first, and, it's their kind of call, along with the coach, for what a lot of the plays actually end up being. But obviously, you can't really directly attribute a team statistic to a player statistic. So I don't think it is bad if people use it in terms of player leaderboards. I don't think that's something that should be frowned upon. But at the same time, you're not going to get a perfect statistic. And I think it's really I think that's something that would be really interesting in the football analytics, industry, is to see how you can divide credit for plays. And I think that would be revolutionary if that occurs.
But do you think that's possible? I guess that kind of leads me into my next question. Like, there's this player tracking data, which is cool because they provide that in the big data bowl, which is they put chips in the players' pads and also in the football, and it spits out GPS coordinate data. And then now there's video, so you can use computer vision. And then there's just qualitative, like scouting notes and stuff like that. Do you think there's any promise in kind of like fusing all of those data sources together, and have some kind of unified model that ingests those different types of information and gives you some kind of intelligible output? And if not, like, what's the main obstacle there?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I think tracking data is obviously making a lot of things, in terms of not really easier, because it is very hard to work with tracking data, especially, obviously having more granular data can give you, I think, better insights, obviously, because it's basically tracking data is basically what you're watching. When you're watching a sport, and you think of how players are, using the eye test essentially, you're basically watching how players move, and that essentially is basically what tracking data does. It gives the positions of the player, the position of the ball, and that essentially is what the eye test is. Obviously, tracking data hasn't captured all of that yet, but hopefully to us, one day, it'll get pretty close to that. But I do think in terms of the assigning credit problem, I think it's very interesting. I don't necessarily think these interactions can be modeled very easily. Like, obviously, I think there are things like, for example, if you're looking at a long pass and you notice that the receiver makes a really, like, it's an overthrow, it's a huge overthrow by the quarterback, but the receiver makes, a really nice catch. With tracking data, as long as, it's accurate to an extent, you should be able to kind of grab that. And that could be something where you can attribute most of the credit to the receiver rather than the passer, hopefully. Now, I think, though, there is a lot of interactions that makes it very complex. I think, with a lot of the advanced, deep learning, AI technology that is coming out, I think you are getting closer to getting some sort of results on that. But I think the whole aspect of reducing like reducing basically a team level play to individual credit is never going to be exact, and there's a lot of factors that we just can't quantify. What goes through the top thought process of the quarterback, what goes through the thought process of the receiver, how about the offensive line, like how are they taking the play. And obviously coaching is a huge aspect of the NFL compared to other sports. I think
That's right.
a lot of these plays are obviously drawn up by basically what the coach thinks, and obviously they should be attributed credit for. And I think obviously I think when you talk about how great a coach is, I think a lot of people would think about that in terms of like that discourse is more common in NFL compared to other sports for sure. Like, or I mean football in general, I guess on the NFL and college level, that is definitely more common the other sports. But that's something you can't really quantify. They're not going to release information on how really a coach thinks. Like, obviously that's going to be stay pretty privatized to the team, and obviously whatever goes on in his mind is never going to be released unless he says it out loud. So there's a lot of aspects that are just not going to be quantifiable. So I think you can get to a decent, like, tracking it definitely accelerates you to get to that solving individual credit problem, and I'm sure there's been research done on that using tracking data, but at the same time you're not going to ever get that perfect per se.
The NFL's hard salary cap creates this strict budget ceiling to some degree. I mean, I know there are mechanisms where you can stretch out cap hits and spend more cash in a given year than it would affect your cap. But I wonder, does it amplify the value of some of these smarter decisions? Is there marginal win value of analytics departments? Is that higher in the NFL than in uncapped leagues like baseball?
Yeah, that's an interesting question, and it kind of goes both ways. Like, obviously, we've seen baseball as the one where I think analytics have made the most impact. Throughout the 21st century. You could see a decent correlation between investing in analytics and winning games and eventually, hopefully, winning the World Series within baseball. Like, that's what I've noticed. Obviously, in football, that's not as amplified, but I do think there is an interesting aspect of that because I think the whole salary cap issue does require someone or a team to be working on the salary cap management side, using analytics to kind of manage that. And I think that is actually a very important aspect of the game because obviously, you could target a player, you could love this player that you want to either trade or draft for depending on the situation. But, if you're not able, if it doesn't support your cap, then obviously it's not going to go through. So I think the whole idea of cap management and applying analytics to it to get basically an optimized roster, I think is actually a very important concept. But it is interesting to see that even though that is true, and even though the MLB has no cap, you still see analytics probably making much more of an impact in baseball compared to other sports. But like kind of like piggybacking off that, like I think like in terms of resources of a team in general, how much they want to invest in analytics, and this may be a little bit out of the question, but just want to kind of touch up on this. But like in terms of how much, you've seen within baseball, like obviously there are differing levels. Like from what I've seen, the Tampa Bay Rays, for example, one team that really loves to invest in analytics, have had decent results in recent times. And other teams like small market teams like the Athletics, they don't really invest a lot in analytics. And obviously, I think in baseball, because there's no cap or anything, a lot of the resources within a team are basically just how much the owner invests into it. And if the owner invests a lot of money, there's more money to be put in analytics. Now, in the NFL, it's interesting because I think obviously, I don't think analytics is being invested in as much. I think there are differing levels, but you don't see. I don't think there's probably a team that may be more, at least within the data science side. I'm not too sure the software engineer side, but I mean, I would be surprised if there's more than 10 data scientists on an NFL team. There are definitely a lot of small departments out there, and I feel like it's kind of it just bring up the question like, is it because how the sport is defined? I think there is an aspect of that because coaching, for example, I think is much more amplified in sports. I mean, sorry, in football, and I think because coaching is so much amplified, they may have more of a decision-making role compared to the front office in general. Like GMs, AGMs, the analytics staff might have a lesser share. It would be really interesting to see analytics being applied more in that aspect, and I'm not sure how many teams actually have someone devoted to the salary cap analytics side. I know it is quite common in basketball from what I've seen. I see a lot of director of salary cap strategies on LinkedIn. In hockey, some people on the hockey ops side. Not sure how much football is investing into it, but I think it would be a pretty interesting realm to explore.
Yeah, and Obviously, I'm not privy to how it works exactly, but from my understanding, like, yeah, the GM has a big part, and usually they have like one right hand man who is like strictly responsible for managing the cap. And I don't know to what extent are they like leveraging like a lot of analytics, where I think a lot of it's just like, how can we get as much talent on our team as possible and like not exceed the cap? But yeah, I feel like there's definitely some delta left there for roster management. I don't necessarily think there's a lot of like unorthodox roster management strategies we've seen employed in the NFL that we've seen in other sports, and that's maybe a new frontier. Now, one of the tricks there is though, like if you don't have a good quarterback, that kind of doesn't all that's out the window, right?
Also, like, like I said, analytics, definitely gets difficult when you're looking at the individual side, especially in the football, because there's so many different positions you have to look for, and creating kind of like separate like metrics for these players on based on individual plays, even with that tracking data, it's so difficult, and that may make it hard on the roster management side because there are positions like obviously I'm sure within teams like we haven't seen much public work on this. I'm sure within teams there's been work done on like offensive linemen. Obviously there's not a lot of work done publicly because you can't really derive how great either specific offensive linemen are or an offensive line total without using some form of tracking data to an extent. And I think it's been done in the Big Data Bowl before, which I guess we'll touch upon later. But, I think it makes it hard on the roster management side because they may want, it depends on how they want to partition it. The front office people who kind of manage all that salary cap aspects. They want to maybe invest a decent amount to some certain offensive linemen, but if there's not a lot of analytics done in it, like they're just gonna have to make a decision on their own, or see like it's kind of like it's gonna be very difficult to kind of make those decisions. So I think maybe that could extend to the general use of analytics in salary cap management. I'm not entirely sure how much it actually is utilized, but I think it's definitely, like I said, I think it's something that I think teams should invest in because I think data in general, information is going to be helpful in all realms.
Yeah, and there's so many variables there. You might identify a tremendous talent who you don't even have to pay top dollar to, but they don't mesh with your scheme. Or their skill set doesn't complement the other players who are on the defensive line, or they're bad in the locker room. There's just so many variables that you have to count for that it becomes really difficult if you're just siloing in on like some kind of machine learning model. You need a lot of that qualitative information too. So I like for me personally, I'm very bullish on this idea of how can we take some of the like domain expertise stuff and fuse it with some of the deep learning models, and we get it's basically like a human in the loop type style modeling, and see if we can get better insights out of that as opposed to like relying on each of them individually and then just in our brains trying to weight how much we value each aspect of it.
For sure, yeah. I think the aspect of interactions in the game, especially, is so important. Football is such a team-based game. I mean, sports in general, obviously, a lot of them are team-based. There are differing levels, like I said, and I think that does affect how much analytics has been invested into the sport so far. So, football such a team aspect, and that's where scouts, coaches, it makes it easier because they can understand these team and human interactions much more than what machine learning can do. Now, we're trying to close that gap, and I think hopefully we'll get there. Especially, I think in sports in general, you're not going to see the human mind go away. I think it's more about finding that correspondence between the two sides, scouting and coaching side and the analytics, and kind of fusing it together to make decisions. I think especially in things like the draft, that's especially important. I think a lot of analytical models these days, like I think if they want to be efficient, a lot of times, especially for, positions where you don't have a lot of direct data and statistics on, basing the model off some scouting scores that you see from, your very experienced scouts, and then applying analytics on top of that. So it's to ensure it's calibrated properly. And I think that would be pretty interesting to see.
Yeah, one thing I've thought about is like sentiment analysis. So they'll write, 3 pages up on some college prospect, and they'll deliver it to the decision makers, and they have to determine like how positive are they about this player, and to what extent is the skill sets that they like in this player matter in terms of their overall impact. But all of that can be quantified. You could turn that into, okay, these are the most important aspects of a edge rusher. And here is how that person described the person's strengths and weaknesses, and you turn that into something quantitative. Do you think that has a pathway in the future?
Yeah, I actually do think there are already companies kind of doing that. Like, I think there are external consultants and people working on projects like that where they're trying to make a large language model basically based off scouting opinions. They ask scouts to feed in their opinions and they make AIs and LLMs that are basically, based off this. And I think that's a great idea. I don't think it's necessarily going to replace scouts. Like I said, I think this is a concept of the whole like debate about whether AI is going to replace humans in general. Like I don't think it will. Like you're always going to need the human mind to do it, and I think all of us hope that it will actually replace that because we all want to be working in some sorts. Especially within the analytics industry. Like we won't want to see a lot of that happen. We want to be there, contributing to the
Yeah.
team. But like I said, yeah, I think that's going to be helpful, and I think it will definitely reduce some of the load that maybe some of these scouts or coaches need, or it will maybe be like used in correspondence with their opinions, just as like kind of like a confirmation factor. Because I think technology helps us, like in general, like if you think about it, there may be a task that some, in a very general sense, there may be a task that someone wants to do, and maybe like I don't know, 50 years ago, that may have been very difficult to do. Now with technology, you still may have to do that task, but technology accelerates you to kind of finish it more efficiently. I think it's the same thing here, where maybe scouts and coaches have to write up all these opinions and everything, and present it to the front office, and talk to it in like multiple meetings per day. Or these scouts could just be giving their opinions, and basically they won't have to devote much time because all their summaries could be converted into some maybe quantitative value or to like an LLM that would make it easier for the front office to just enter questions like how well do you think this player is at this aspect of the game, and then base it off a correspondence between the scouting and any traditional analytics.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many times I've seen someone do the most unbelievable breakdown, clearly defining all of a player's strengths and weaknesses at the most granular level. And then they'll come out and they'll say, I think he's a third rounder. And I'm like, wait, what? The skills that you said mattered would make this guy a potential Pro Bowler. So I think it falls apart at that last part at a lot of times where the scouts, they should not be in my opinion, for the most part, they should not be making a grand proclamation about the extent in which each of these skills matter. I think there's other people, like potentially in the front office or on the coaching staffs, that can make that declaration. And this is a way of bridging that gap of, here, just tell me what they do good and bad, and we'll let the model and the ultimate decision makers determine to what extent we value each of those granular skills.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think it's good to appreciate, especially as like data driven people. I think it's great to appreciate those scouts who have an appreciation for analytics. I'm not sure how much it is in football compared to other sports. I'm sure it's maybe still lingering in baseball, and we saw this if you watch the Moneyball movie. You could see this. But, there are scouts, traditional scouts out there who just don't like a lot about data and numbers, and they're like, you have no knowledge of the game because yeah, it's true. A lot of the analytics people probably scouts probably have gaps in everyday aspects of work or just everyday aspects of life. I think that's really what technology has done, and I think a lot of people are not realizing it, like I think yet, but I think without realizing, they're like kind of facing like the new realm of technology, and they are like implicitly knowing like that this is basically changing their lives.
Something we've brought up a couple times now is the NFL Big Data Bowl. And for those who are not privy to what this is, it's a science fair type competition hosted online and hosted by the NFL. And we're actually teammates in this for the next competition. And essentially, what they do is they release a ton of tracking data, stuff that's generally proprietary, not given to the public, so basically sold to the teams and used by broadcast partners, etc. Not sold to the teams, just provided to them. And there's been so many cool projects that ultimately led to stats that you now see on TV with like next gen stats, missed tackle probabilities, man zone coverage, pre-snap probabilities, etc. So my question is, what are you looking forward to most about competing this year? Obviously, we don't know the prompt, so that's one aspect that I'm very excited to see. But how about for you?
Yeah, I'm really excited, definitely excited to work with you and our other team members. I think it's, hopefully we do a great job. And yeah, like we've seen in the past, the Big Data Bowl has been very impactful in changing, all these aspiring data analysts, even if they were not too interested in sports, maybe, they just kind of tried out for the Big Data Bowl and, it definitely probably got them, like it's, a piece of portfolio work that they can use. And I'm sure a lot of them have gotten jobs with front offices. But yeah, I mean, I'm really excited. I think working with tracking data is really interesting. I haven't worked with it really on the football level. I tried to compete in the Big Data Bowl like the last 1 or 2 years. Didn't really work out. So this year, definitely the year where I think, I'm ready for us to make that big stride. But yeah, I mean, working with tracking data is really interesting. And I've, obviously experienced it a little bit with hockey, working this summer with the Pens. I think the idea of tracking data is really interesting because I think a lot of people, and this is something I even like actually like I understand I did this myself, but a lot of times when I used to make personal projects like with very simple event level data, you would draw these conclusions based off these models, but they won't really like to some extent, yes, they do apply, but like at the same time, it's like can you really draw such these intricate conclusions based off just events data. But tracking data, on the other hand, is things kind of that you like watch basically at the game, all boiled down to quantitative values describing the position of the player, velocity, acceleration, and same thing goes for the football. So I think it's going to be really interesting. I think it also makes you as a person exercise that like problem solving ability and also like obviously, I think a lot of people, especially with personal projects, what I used to do, like I didn't understand a lot of the theoretical basis behind a lot of models. So, just put everything into an XGBoost model. Let's see what it does. That's kind of what I used to do, especially when I was more on the inexperienced level, when I was doing some of this stuff in high school. But, now I've like taken like a deep found appreciation for like kind of, the idea that you have to kind of like understand the premise behind these models, like what are you doing, and even like when you're engineering features out of these tracking data, you're gonna have to use a lot of mathematical and like physics based concepts, like especially with tracking data we're trying to see maybe like how players move, like how can you really do like that's something that's like basically that people work on on a research PhD level in like math and physics. And I think it really makes you a better researcher in general, and I think that's what really teams are looking for. They want people who have, a combined, they have good domain knowledge, they have great statistical knowledge, understand how models work, and they have great problem solving ability. And I think that's why it's such a great competition, and I'm really excited to work on it this year.
Yeah, I am too. One of the pet projects I have is understanding edge rusher rush paths. So the difference between someone who tries to go around the corner versus someone who collapses the pocket and essentially pushes the guy straight in line back with the quarterback. Can we kind of tease out which one is more effective? And what I ended up having to look at is like understanding of like fluid dynamics. And there was a project where people look at water going through like rocks and charcoal filters, and the math behind that actually extrapolated pretty well to like the pass rusher path stuff. So I think it's an area where you can take domain knowledge from other areas and apply it, because it's, as you mentioned, it's still a novel area of exploration. In fact, even though we've had tracking data for a little while in the NFL, the amount of applicable insights is still very small. And there's not teams that are like modeling plays and then putting them out on the field, at least to my understanding. It's more like, oh, can we predict tendencies? Do we know when to go for it on fourth down? So the exciting part for me is it's still in its infancy, and we might actually uncover something groundbreaking in the next few months, and that might actually have an impact on the real NFL. And that prospect is just very exciting for me.
Yeah, for sure. I think, I think the sports analytics industry still definitely needs young stages until Like obviously you said, there's some sports like baseball which have been doing it for a little while, but I think especially it makes it interesting in the sports which are have been like kind of less explored so far is that you're kind of like a change maker within the sport. These projects that have been within the big data bowl, I'm sure that teams have applied it to some sense, probably not straight off copying of them, but tweaking it, taking those ideas. And you could see probably in front offices, they're probably reading up public research all the time, on like other forms of, how analytics has been applied in sports, especially when you're looking at tracking data and looking at those movement aspects, looking at kinematics, fluid dynamics. Those are all like so essential. And I think it makes the field so interesting. And I think it also does require a lot of expertise. I think, it's getting very competitive as a field. And, there are positions I think that are starting to like only be open to like PhDs now because they want, people with great knowledge on like these very theoretical side and mathematics, physics, the theoretical components behind machine learning, computer science. And I think, but it does make it interesting. It's almost like you're doing research. It's basically like another form of research. And I think I'm really excited to work on this type of data and hopefully, we can make it pretty far.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm looking forward to it. And, I will say this. I think a lot of people are using AI in their daily lives and they're not talking about it. I think there's a little bit of shame or some guilt about it. But I'll say this, it has its limitations. It makes mistakes. All of that's true. But one thing it's really been able to do for me is accelerate my learning. So I will basically prompt it in a way that it'll present information in a way that's most digestible for my learning style, whether that's visual or exemplary, styles of teaching. And I've been able to kind of dip my toe in areas that I would normally be like, okay, that's way too dense for me. I don't know, differential calculus, etc., or deep learning, blah blah blah. I'm just not even gonna bother because I know I'd have to sink so much time. But now I can like at least have some conceptual understandings of a lot of these topics, and hopefully I can kind of fuse that all together and just be better at problem solving in general. Then hopefully you team up with specialists who have all the technical or mathematical expertise. And I think that we've assembled a really nice team in that sense. So I'm just excited for what we're going to do.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I think, like you said, I think AI, obviously its use could be debated, a lot, but I think to an extent, it definitely accelerates a lot of things. I think within sports analytics, especially if you're in the industry, you want to learn, you're really passionate about the field. So I don't think, there are people there basically fully relying on AI essentially to like do anything, do any projects or anything. I think a lot of people are using it out there just to kind of learn and accelerate their workflow. And I think that's really how I think AI should be kind of incorporated in daily lives in the workplace or outside the workplace. I think, if no one's really using AI to a full extent, you're doing these projects because, and you want to learn, like I've even done like on all the experiences I've had, I've realized that I'm just learning more. Like obviously it is, a struggle to get these opportunities in the first place in a lot of sense. It's a very competitive industry, but through them, it's not like you have to be an expert. You learn a lot of new things. So like having AI there just to kind of accelerate your workflow is good, but I don't think it should be obviously relied on fully. And I think the learning process is, I think, the most important part of it.
Yeah. All right. Well, I appreciate you coming on, and I'm super stoked for the big data bowl, and we'll definitely keep our audience cued into what we're working on and what happens once we submit our project. But until next time, that's been an episode of The Edge.